Hello, I'm Robert. I'm volunteer fact checker and helping you to escape many things. And this time I just want to talk about this idea of cut it up the way it is, which seems to have resonated with the mainstream media. And it's been running as if it was something new, a new idea from Ukraine and its allies. But that's actually been what Ukraine has been wanting all the way along. And so I just want to help with this, because a lot of the reason why people get scared is because they falsely presented in the news as if as if Ukraine and its allies wanted somehow to get back against Russia for invading Ukraine. And that's not what it's about. They want the war to stop where it is. That's all they want. Just to stop along the line where the fighting is. And that's always what they want for the last year. They had different ideas before then, but for the last year, that's what they've been wanting. And so, something about Trump's use of the phrase "the way it is," that seems to have been what shifted the way it's been reported in the mainstream media. But nothing has changed in the way that Ukraine and its allies are thinking about it. So, I want to explain a little bit about this, and to help you to understand also that Putin is not being backed into a corner in any way. No, as this is from NATO itself. Fact, no one has backed Russia into a corner. It's hard to encircle a country with 11 time zones. So this is NATO here, NATO's borders with Russia, and that's Alaska, and Russia stretches all the way across there. And there's nothing in this war that could in any way back Putin into a corner, in any way whatsoever. No conceivable possible way they could do that. And more exactly, you might as well say that Russia is encircling NATO. That wouldn't make sense either, but it doesn't make sense either way. And most of its border is along here, land border, and then you've got the long sea border. So then I want to talk here about how, if you look at on an actual map, then you can see how tiny Ukraine is relative to the vast size of Russia. Russia is the largest country in the world, far larger than China or the United States. And the occupied area of Ukraine, including Crimea, that's roughly the size of Italy. So that's quite a large area, but it's really small compared with Russia. And then if you go and look at narrow it down to where they're actually fighting right now, I think very few people would actually realize how very small the fighting area is where all the fighting is going on. So in 2022 it was quite a bit bigger. So Russia came in like this and took a very large area there, roughly the same size as that green bit there, excluding Crimea. And then Ukraine was able to liberate all of that very quickly within a few weeks. And then it kind of stabilized around here. And then Ukraine took another bit there. And by the end of 2022, then it did by the end of November, then this was the front line. It's very much like it is today. And for the last nearly 3 years, since end of November 2022 to the present, Russia has been fighting within that white line. If you look closely, you can see between the pale green and the grey, which is the unoccupied area of Ukraine, there's a fine white line. And the thickness of that white line is roughly the thickness of the area that Russia's been fighting in since the end of 2022. So that leaves the question, why is Putin doing this? Why is he fighting so long and achieving so little? And especially when you look at his priorities. So the Assad regime had control of Syria, and it's quite a large area of Syria, and this gave Russia a base in the Middle East, a base because the Russians could travel freely pretty much throughout Syria because of their support of Assad. And they had a seaport there, they had an air base, their only seaport in the Middle East, indeed the only seaport outside the former Soviet Union. And at the end of last year, at the beginning of this, December to January, Putin had a choice. He could join Assad's side and help prevent his regime from being overthrown by rebels, many of them in open-top vehicles, or he could continue fighting as he'd been doing for the nearly last couple of years or so. He could continue fighting, and he had one particular place that he was preoccupied with back then, and he said, well, I'll continue with the fighting. I'm not interested in Syria. And so Assad's regime was deposed. The Russian soldiers in Syria, instead of fighting back, they focused on getting out of there with all their assets as quickly as they could. And Russia abandoned Syria, abandoned its only port in the Mediterranean. And now, at least until the war ends, because the Strait of Bosporus is close to competence by Turkey, then the only way that Russia can get to Syria is from Kaliningrad or from up here, and it can sail all that long distance all the way around through those very narrow straits, and it could get there. And Russia hasn't got the ability to project force across oceans. It's got a coastal navy. So that was a big loss to Russia. It doesn't have aircraft carriers. It doesn't have the sort of ships that can sail long distances carrying large amounts of force on them. So Russia is now confined to, its ships are pretty much confined to that area. And they do various excursions beyond, of course there's subscope beyond, but they can't really project much force beyond that area. It's called a coastal navy, or technical term, a brown water navy. So Putin gave all that up just in order to advance a tiny fraction there. Imagine that Putin had a big map of Russia on his wall, then he'd have to use a magnifying glass to see where the fighting is going on, if it included all of Russia in the same map. And unless it was a very big one, he was stretching a long way, but if it was a reasonable sized map, then he couldn't see it. The fighting that he's been doing, he couldn't see it except with a magnifying glass. So why is Putin doing this? And there are lots of ideas about why he's doing it and what his reason is. But I think it's fair to say that nobody knows which of those is correct, because there are different people who champion different ideas for the explanation of why Putin's doing this. And only Putin really knows himself why he's doing this. So and then I just want to explain as well that from the ordinary Russian has no idea really why they're fighting, but they don't even know there's a war going on. The ordinary Russian, this is a special military operation. Putin, with his propaganda, he manages the flow of information, so they just have no idea about the scale of it. Even the ones where they're sending soldiers there, they just don't realize that this is a proper war going on. And we saw that in August 2024, when the Ukrainians crossed over into Kursk Oblast. They took a small city called Sudzha because, in order to protect themselves, because they had intelligence that Russia was about to attack them from that side of the border. And when they did that, then for the people in Sudzha, the war just started. They said, why are we suddenly at war? What with the Ukrainians? What's happened? And they had no idea that there was a war going on. They knew it was a special military operation. They knew there was some exchange of artillery and stuff. That's about all that they knew. And so this shows you that Putin, far from being cornered, then for most Russians this is just not very important at all. And the main way that they're beginning to notice now is with the shortage of gasoline. And that's beginning to affect ordinary Russians. And they're sort of grumbling and thinking, why are we short of gasoline? And Putin does not explain to them. He has not told the Russian people but the reality is that Ukraine has destroyed a significant percentage, I think over 30% of the oil refining capacity, which is within reach of Ukraine's missiles already. So it's got cruise missiles which can carry over a ton for 3,000 kilometers, and it's got drones, and that's a recent development. And since August to the present day, most of Russian oil refineries within range of the Ukrainian missiles, and a lot of them are no longer functioning because if you hit the right part of an oil refinery with a 1-ton missile, then it's going to take an awful lot of repairs before it's back in order again. And this is a genuine military target because these oil refineries are supplying gasoline, diesel, jet fuel and so on to the war. So, but the side effect is, and also the funding from it is going to Putin. The side effect is these gasoline shortages. And Putin does it just like ordinary Americans. They grumble when the price of the gasoline goes up. The Russians grumble because it's not just the price going up, it's actually rationed. They can't get enough gasoline for things they want to do. And so this is the sort of thing that might affect Putin, because he eventually, a dictator knows very well that he can only rule so long as the people below him also have a reasonably positive idea of what he's doing, and go down to the ordinary people, and shaped information shaped with propaganda. If they don't have a positive idea, a positive view of him, then gradually the people at the top will start grumbling and say we should have a different leader. And it's not by voting out, but it's by grumbling out, essentially, is how the leader would change. So Putin is very, very careful about that sort of thing. So things like gasoline shortages, these minor irritations, that sort of thing that might possibly stop the war. And I just want to talk about this tiny amount that Russia has added. So since 2025 to the end of September, Russia has added 1,500 kilometers, 150 by 10 kilometers. That's a minute area. That's less than 1,000th or 10,000th of the area of Russia. And he's been fighting all year to expand Russia's territory by 10,000th. And he's lost thousands and thousands of soldiers. He's losing 100 soldiers to add 1 square kilometer to 27 million square kilometers. And that's the, why is he doing that? It's not especially, I mean, it's quite good industrially. Once except they're destroying everything as they go. It's not really that important compared to the rest of Russia. And that's why it's so puzzling as to why he's even doing it. What's it all about? So that's the situation. That's Russia is. It all depends on Putin. As one person, he can just decide tomorrow, I've had enough, I'm going to stop. And then once he's done that, then Ukraine and its allies, they're all ready for a ceasefire. As long as Putin says a ceasefire, then you get a ceasefire along that front line there, along that white line. And then that'll be the war over. And so I want to explain one other thing about how the ceasefire would work. So there's a difference between de facto and de jure, so I want to explain that. So the way that Ukraine's allies are thinking about it and what they're presenting to Russia is we just agree to stop fighting, that the line just stays where it is, and then we can then negotiate after that over who actually is going to be in charge of occupied Ukraine. Now, that's just kind of diplomatic speak, because everyone knows that what's going to happen is that Ukraine is going to say that we don't recognize your right to be in charge of occupied Ukraine, but we agree not to fight about it. And Russia is going to say we have every right. This is part of Russia, and we're going to keep hold of it. And then that'll be pretty much all the negotiating they can do. But what this means is because they haven't legally given it to Russia, then in my lifetime I've seen many changes. So I saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that nobody predicted that, even really quite a bit before, even quite close to when it actually happened. Seen the end of apartheid in South Africa. Of course, recently we've seen the fall of Assad. Nobody expected that, and that happened very suddenly and quite surprising. And in the same way, maybe at some point, the current Russian regime will end. Probably maybe at the end of when Putin steps down eventually, when he's decided he's been a president for long enough. And maybe they'll decide they want to go in a different direction. So Ukraine is taking the long view here. And it's saying, as is quite normal in this sort of situation, and it's saying, well, right now we're just going to be negotiating, but the negotiations are going nowhere. But just by negotiating and saying our point of view and they saying theirs, as long as we don't legally give it to Russia, then sometime in the future there may be a different Russian president. And they've lived through the breakup of the Soviet Union. They know how things can change. So that's the way that the war can end. A de facto ceasefire, where both sides agree to stop fighting, and then they negotiate, and they know the negotiations are going to go nowhere. They can negotiate about other things, but Russia is going to keep control of the occupied areas of Ukraine. So that is what is on the table for Russia. Putin just needs to say, yes, we agree to stop fighting. And whatever the reason it is that Putin is fighting, one of the things that many people I follow say is that Putin is probably reluctant to stop fighting because whatever the reason is he's doing it, he knows that it's irreversible, that once he stops, it's going to be, as long as it lasts for long enough, like a few days to a week or two or so, it's going to be extremely difficult to restart it again. Because Ukraine will dig in and it'll be all the security guarantees and then just trying to explain to the world why they started fighting again and so on. And with a very, especially with the new drone wall, which makes it extremely difficult. Drones that can fly faster than a motorbike and that can destroy tanks and helicopters and things. And with that kind of a front line there, and the Ukraine getting more and more air defences and everything, once the war stops, it's likely to stay stopped. So that may be partly why Putin is so cautious about stopping, because he's a very risk-averse person, and for him the risk here is, well, things are going to be a bit different if we stop. We've got a wartime economy, we're all geared around fighting, and if we stop, then what's going to happen? And of course, Ukraine, its allies and NATO and the United States are reassuring Russia that if they stop, then gradually sanctions will be eased and make things far easier for Russia if it stops the fighting. So there's a carrot there as well to kind of encourage Russia to stop, to say to Putin, to be okay, you can stop. And then it's really about being, and then I don't think I've explained. So what Ukraine and its allies have discovered for the last several years is that Putin, if you try to be nice to Putin, and that's what Trump has found in all his meetings with Putin, he's nice to Putin, Putin's agreeable to him, he's agreeable to Putin. Then he goes home and Melania Trump tells him that the Ukrainian army chose that moment to do their biggest bombardment ever on the civilians in Ukraine. Not so many people actually die in these bombardments nowadays, because you get these air raid sirens, they go underground, or they go into their bomb shelters or the metro. But some people do die because they don't get to there in time or whatever, and then you get buildings destroyed and so on. And this Putin's idea is that when the other side starts seeming nice and friendly and they're offering concessions and so on, then take everything they offer and then attack even more. And that's how Putin responds to that. He always does. He has all the way through the war. And then when the other side is kind of tough and strong, then Putin starts thinking about a genuine peace. So when you look at people like United Kingdom, France, and Trump now in the United States, when they start being tough, that is why they do it. It's not because they want to attack Russia, it's because they want the war to stop. And they know that if they are big and tough, then Putin then starts getting interested in peace. Very, very clear pattern. So please don't be scared when you hear people like Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron or Donald Trump being tough to Putin, because they do that because that's how to get peace. It's the only way. The only thing that works with Putin. So try to understand that. So we've got the gasoline shortages. Then there's the Trump's sanctions on Putin. The secondary sanctions they just did yesterday or so. Then these had a very surprisingly strong effect on India and China. And they are finding it. They are already reducing the purchases of Russian oil, and the sales of oil finance the Russian government, which then finances the war. And if they can cut the sales of the oil, then the government will not have enough money to pay for the war. They will try to find the funding in other ways, but eventually they're likely to stop. So that's the idea behind that. And the idea is just building up all these pressures, the gasoline shortages, and then now I've talked about the tomahawks. I'll just briefly talk about the tomahawks. So but the US sent thousands of them, but it's not going to do that. I'm going to send them maybe 50. So Ukraine, as I said, is already hitting these oil refineries over a vast distance. It's rather indeterminate how far it is. And certainly right up to the Baltic Sea and over to the Caspian Sea and a little bit further there. And it doesn't need the tomahawks for that. They're not the small numbers. If US gave Ukraine 1,000 tomahawks, then that would significantly change the picture. And Ukraine and US have several thousand of them. But in reality, US is only likely to give maybe 50 tomahawks at the max. And that number 50 is quite interesting because it's double the number of big ships in the Black Sea Fleet. And as I explained in my previous video about Vatican, do listen to it if you haven't, then Ukraine's allies, not Ukraine itself, have vast overmatch of Russia in the air and in the sea. And Ukraine doesn't even have a navy, but this managed to sink a third of Russia's Black Sea Fleet with its not the best cruise missiles, the Neptune. It's got better ones now and better and also its sea drones, but it sunk a third of them mainly with the Neptune. And so Russia's Black Sea Fleet is extremely vulnerable. It's a valid target because it fires missiles at Ukraine, and those 50 Tomahawk cruise missiles, coincidentally, are enough to sink the entire Black Sea Fleet, all the big ships in it, at two per ship, about 20 odd of them. So this is my own hypothesis, based on something General Petraeus said, that this is because Zelensky said that there's something that the United States can give them, which could lead to the war ending without actually using them. And so that's the idea of the Tomahawk as a military psychological lever, which is that it wouldn't be publicized. We just hear that the United States has at last given the Tomahawks to Ukraine, and then mysteriously Russia says, oh well, we've always wanted peace. It's about time to we agreed to a ceasefire. What have you all been fussing about for the last year? And then mysteriously the war would end. But what might be happening behind the scenes, if that's what happens, if that's the news that we get, is that Zelensky might have said privately to Putin, do you want to be the first leader of Russia since the 18th century who no longer has a Black Sea Fleet at all? We've sunk a third of it, but the remaining 2/3, that could be gone tomorrow. And you surely don't want that, so let's end this war. So that is the idea of the tomahawks as a lever. So they really would do nothing. People talk about using them for oil refineries. 50 tomahawks aren't going to do much to the oil refineries. But they could, as a military psychological lever, they could make a difference they could end the war just by not actually doing it. I wouldn't achieve anything to actually sink the Black Sea Fleet, but to threaten to do it might end the war. Maybe that's how Zelensky's thinking. I don't know. I don't know. He hasn't said, of course. And nobody else is saying. But so we have these different ways it might end. Gasoline shortages unable to export his oil, so he runs out of money, sanctions, and then perhaps the flamingos. Eventually, maybe Ukraine can use its flamingos to do military psychological labor of similar type. And but the main thing is that Russia is very, very, very weak. It's only just hanging on in Ukraine, and that Zelensky wants an immediate, unconditional ceasefire along current lines. And what Russia is saying is saying to Ukraine at the moment is, okay, we'll agree to ceasefire, but before the ceasefire starts, you must let us rapidly move forward and take a large area here that we haven't been able to take before, which is extremely fortified and very difficult for Russia to take. And if you let us occupy that area very quickly, then after we've done that, then we will agree to a ceasefire. And of course, Ukraine doesn't believe that at all. Why would you? Because Russia says it wants to do this before the ceasefire, as a condition for the ceasefire, that Ukraine has to give up all this. They just believe that Russia's going to take all this land and then continue on with the fight. So it's clearly not a genuine offer. And so they're wanting and Zelensky doesn't actually have the authority anyway to do that. He simply can't do that. As president, he doesn't have that legal right to do that. So it's a complete non-starter. But what there is there, and has been there for a year, for Putin, is just to say, I agree to stop. He says, I agree to stop, then I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I'll stop this within half an hour. So I think I pretty much covered most of what I was wanting to talk about. Anything I haven't covered here? So, just the basic idea that Putin is not cornered. Only Russians. So let's just summarize the main points. Russia is not cornered in any way whatsoever. If anyone is cornered, it's Ukraine. The fighting is over this minuscule area, which adding 1 square kilometre to over 27 million square kilometres at the cost of 100 soldiers. And why Putin is doing that, there are various ideas, but we don't know which of them is correct. And that Putin needs to be persuaded that it's time to stop. And if he does do that, it's better for Russia. The sanctions will fall away. There's this pointless war where thousands of Russians are dying for no apparent reason except some idea fixed that Putin, he's not crazy, but he's got a very fixed idea of something in his mind that is telling him to just keep on fighting. And if he can be persuaded to shift his view just tiny little bit, it's not even a big shift really. Just to say, okay, I've got enough, I'm done. And then if he can be persuaded to shift that as a result of the gasoline shortages, as a result of the oil sanctions, as a result of the Ukraine's allies talking tough, because that's what leads Putin to start thinking about peace, then the war can end. And that is how, so I help you understand, this is how the leaders of the Ukraine and its allies, how its leaders have thought about this all the way through the war. The media has not reported this very well at all. That's what they want. They just want the war to stop. And you can ignore any suggestion they actually want to fight. That's not what it's about at all. And they give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself. So they're helping Ukraine to defend itself. All the things that Ukraine hits, like the oil refineries, like the piles of ammunition factories, the piles and piles of missiles that they blew up, and so on. That's all to stop Russia from firing those things at Ukraine and to end the war. And so it's hard to know. It's got very difficult to fight along the front line anymore. They might just grind to a halt for other reasons towards the end of this year as a result of the drones getting faster and more capable. But there does seem to be a genuine possibility that we could see a ceasefire And that's what all this is about, and that's the reason for the sanctions. That's the reason for feeling tough. That's for speaking tough and everything. So please do not be scared, because and there's no way. I explained in my previous video about Admiral Radkin. There's no way that Russia is going to be attacking NATO at all. I've already talked about that, so I won't talk about that again. And it's all about just getting Russia to stop this pointless fighting over this white line. So hope that this helps. And nobody else wants this war to continue. And the ordinary Russians, they don't even know there is a war going on. They think it's a special military operation. They think it's not a big deal. They think the rest of the world is looking at them favourably because that's what TASS tells them. So anyway, so hopefully that helps you feel rather less scared about all this and to have a better context for understanding what's been going on and why they're being tough with Putin, and that being tough with Putin is actually the way to go towards peace, and that's what they've realised. And so there's significant possibility of peace now because of the coalescing together and just being tough with Putin. And the more that continues, the more there's a possibility that this war might eventually actually end. So hopefully that helps you be less scared. And I'll put a link to this article in the video description when I upload this. Any questions, be sure to say, because our Doomsday Debunk group on ddebunked.org, so do go and visit us there to both help people who are scared or if you're scared yourself and need help.